my name is Miss Carrie, and welcome to the Weeby Reads book group. This is the first of two videos for Because of Winn Dixie by Kate DiCamillo. The book that we're using as a reference is the Kids Book Club book, and we're also using our own Weeby Reads Readers Notebooks. The links are in the comments below. I wanted to start out by telling you a little bit about what Because of Winn Dixie is about. So it's about a 10-year-old little girl named Opal and her father, and they have just moved to the fictional town of Naomi, Florida. And while they're there, Opal is experiencing a lot of emotions, a lot of longing and loneliness for her mother in particular, who has left the family, and also for her old friends back home. And then one day, everything changes when Opal meets Winn Dixie, a stray dog, who really steps in and helps her connect with all of the people in her new town. So, using the Kids Book Club book, I have pulled a little bit of information about our author, Kate DiCamillo. Now, Kate DiCamillo has written a lot of books, including The Tale of Despero. She's also written a book called Bink and Golly, which is on our readers' suggestion list. But this particular book, Because of Winn Dixie, is very special to her. And the reason for that is she was born in Philadelphia, but she was actually raised in a town in Florida because of continuing illnesses that she had, like pneumonia. And that town that she grew up in Florida is very similar to the fictional town of Naomi, which she talks about in the book. And this is a quote from her. She says, "Because of Winn Dixie owes a lot to my childhood in the South. I wrote the book during the worst winter on record in Minnesota, where I live now. I was homesick for the South, the warmth, the southern cadences of speech. Also, for the first time in my life, I was without a dog, and I desperately wanted one. Because of Winn Dixie is a product of those two longings, for the South and for a dog." So this was a very special book which connected with her, and I suspect will connect with a lot of you guys as well. So the way that this is going to work, today we are going to read together the first two chapters of the book, and then the chapters 3 through 23, which are almost all of the rest of the book, I want you to read on your own, kind of as you have time over the next couple of weeks. Work on some of the questions in the reader's notebook to make sure that you're understanding what you're reading as you're going through it. And then we're going to come back in a couple of weeks and we're going to read the last 3 chapters together and then discuss some of the outcomes of the book. So, are you ready to get started? Let's go. Because of Winn Dixie. Because of Winn Dixie by Kate DiCamillo. For Tracy and Beck, because they listened first. Chapter 1. My name is India Opal Bologna, and last summer my daddy, the preacher, sent me to the store for a box of macaroni and cheese, some white rice, and 2 tomatoes, and I came back with a dog. This is what happened. I walked into the produce section of the Winn Dixie grocery store to pick out my 2 tomatoes, and I almost bumped right into the store manager. He was standing there all red-faced, screaming and waving his arms around. "Who let that dog in here?" he kept on shouting. "Who let a dirty dog in here?" At first, I didn't see a dog. There were just a lot of vegetables rolling around on the floor, tomatoes and onions and green peppers. And there was what seemed like a whole army of Winn Dixie employees running around waving their arms just the same way the store manager was waving his. And then the dog came running around the corner. He was a big dog and ugly. He looked like he was having a real good time. His tongue was hanging out and he was wagging his tail. He skidded to a stop and smiled right at me. I'd never before in my life seen a dog smile, but that's what he did. He pulled back his lips and showed me all his teeth, and then he wagged his tail so hard that he knocked some oranges off a display and they went rolling everywhere, mixing in with the tomatoes and onions and green peppers. The manager screamed, "Somebody grab that dog!" The dog went running over to the manager, wagging his tail and smiling. He stood up on his hind legs. You could tell all he wanted to do was get face to face with the manager and thank him for the good time he was having in the produce department. But somehow, he ended up knocking the manager over. And the manager must have been having a bad day, because lying there on the floor right in front of everybody, he started to cry. The dog leaned over him, real concerned, and licked his face. "Please," said the manager, "somebody call the pound." "Wait a minute," I hollered. "That's my dog. Don't call the pound." All the Winn Dixie employees, turned around and looked at me, and I knew I had done something big, maybe stupid too. But I couldn't help it. I couldn't let that dog go to the pound. "Here, boy," I said. The dog stopped licking the manager's face and put his ears up in the air and looked at me, like he was trying to remember where he knew me from. "Here, boy," I said again. And then I figured out that the dog was probably just like everybody else in the world and that he would want to get called by a name. Only I didn't know what his name was, so I just said the first thing that came to my head. I said, "Here, Winn Dixie." And that dog came trotting over to me just like he'd been doing it his whole life. The manager sat up, gave me a hard stare like maybe I was making fun of him or something. "It's his name," I said, "honest." The manager said, "Don't you know not to bring a dog into a grocery store?" "Yes, sir," I told him. "I got in by mistake. I'm sorry, it won't happen again." "Come on, Winn Dixie," I said to the dog. I started walking, and he followed along behind me as I went out the produce department and down the cereal aisle and past all the cashiers and out the door. Once we were safe outside, I checked him over real careful, and he didn't look that good. He was big, but skinny. You could see his ribs. And there were bald patches all over him. Places where he didn't have any fur at all. Mostly, he looked like a big piece of brown carpet that had been left out in the rain. "You're a mess," I told him. "I bet you don't belong to anybody." He smiled at me. He did that thing again where he pulled back his lips and showed me his teeth. He smiled so big that it made him sneeze. It was like he was saying, "I know I'm a mess, isn't it funny?" It's hard not to immediately fall in love with a dog that has a good sense of humor. "Come on," I told him. "Let's see what the preacher has to say about you." And the two of us, me and Winn Dixie, started walking home. Chapter 2. That summer, I found Winn Dixie was also the summer me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida, so he could be the new preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy is a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach. And so in my mind, I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India, and that's how I got my first name, but he calls me by my second name, Opal, because that was his mother's name, and he loved her a lot. Anyway, me and Winn Dixie walked home. I told him how I got my name, and I told him how I just moved to Naomi. I also told him about the preacher and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers and suffering people to go to the grocery store. "But you know what?" I told Winn Dixie. "You're a suffering dog, so maybe he'll take you right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you." Winn Dixie looked up at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping, like something was wrong with one of his legs, and I have to admit he stunk bad. He was an ugly dog, but already I loved him with all my heart. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn Dixie he had to behave right and be quiet because this was an all-adult trailer park, and the only reason I get to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher and I was a good, quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception. And I told Winn Dixie he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats or Mrs. Detwiller's little yappy Yorkie dog, Samuel. Winn Dixie looked up at me as I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. "Sit," I told him when we got to my trailer, and he sat right down. He had good manners. "Stay here," I told him. "I'll be right back." The preacher was sitting in the living room, working on a little fold-out table. He had papers spread all around him, and he was rubbing his nose, which always means that he's thinking hard. "Daddy," I said. He said back. "Daddy, do you know how you always tell me that we should help those less fortunate than ourselves?" He said. He rubbed his nose and looked around at his papers. "Well," I said, "I found a less fortunate at the grocery store." "Is that right?" He said. "Yes, sir," I told him. I stared at the preacher really hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle hiding in its shell in there, thinking about things and not ever sticking its head out to the world. "Daddy, I was wondering, could this less fortunate, could he stay with us for a while?" Finally, the preacher looked up at me. "Opal," He said, "What are you talking about?" "I found a dog," I told him, "and I want to keep him." "No dogs," the preacher said. "We've talked about this before. You don't need a dog." "I know it," I said. "I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look," I said. I went to the trailer door and I hollered, "Winn Dixie!" Winn Dixie's ears shot up in the air and he grinned and sneezed, and then he came limping up the steps and into the trailer and put his head right into the preacher's lap, right on top of the pile of papers. The preacher looked at Winn Dixie, and he looked at his ribs and his matted up fur and the places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, the dog smelled pretty bad. Winn Dixie looked up at the preacher. He pulled back his lips and showed the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth and wagged his tail and knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table. Then he sneezed and some more papers fluttered off the table. "What did you call this dog?" the preacher asked. "Winn Dixie," I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that Winn Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell. "Well," said the preacher, "he's a stray if I've ever seen one." He put down his pencil and scratched Winn Dixie behind the ears. "And a less fortunate, too, that's for sure." "Are you looking for a home?" the preacher asked real soft to Winn Dixie. Winn Dixie wagged his tail. "Well," the preacher said, "I guess you've found one."